All right. We're all set. Recording.
Okay. Okay. As a preliminary matter, this is Donald Davenport, Chair of the Hampden Board of Selectmen. Permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated in the agenda are present and can hear me. Bob Markle,
Present.
John Flynn, Mary Ellen Glover,
Present.
Pam Courtney. And
Pam is here.
Okay.
Pam is here.
All right. We'll be joined by Howard Barber and Patrick Kiernan, as well as Weissman, and I believe. Good evening. The open meeting of the Hampden Board of Selectmen is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth through the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of COVID-19 virus, we've been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings, and as such, the governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order, which you can find posted with the agenda materials for this meeting, allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberation of the meeting. For this meeting, the Hampden Board of Selectmen is convening using Zoom video conferencing as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. This evening, because we have a rather lengthy agenda and a number of items on it and a number of guests, I would ask that people who have questions would just use the chat function, and we'll see how that works for this evening. I'd like to begin by the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Is anyone recording the meeting other than us? Nobody? Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
The first item on the agenda is the Action Ambulance contract.
Don?
Yeah.
If I could beg your indulgence, if I could just ask for a moment of silence. We lost two people in the past week. Lenny Grunstrom, who recently served on the Fire Chief Committee, and Bob Berger, a good friend who served on the advisory as a member of the Board of Selectmen, and pretty much any volunteer role anyone asked him to. So a moment of silence for two good citizens of town who never said no.
Okay. Observe that, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. The first item on the agenda is the Action Ambulance contract. I assume the town council has that?
Yes, we received the contract proposal. I sent it to town council. I reviewed it with her today. It needs some additional work. We pretty much have narrowed down the issues. I'll send the board. She was going to send me a marked up copy. I'll send it to the board and we'll go through it. And most of the changes are not substantive. It is going to have to go back to Action Ambulance for their approval, and I would hope we could bring it in for June 1 for your approval and signature. If not, then it would be the 8th.
Okay. Just a couple of things that I want to bring attention. The fee for the year is $333,000, and I think in our budget we put $330,000, so we may have to amend that with the advisory committee.
Okay.
The other thing is, I was looking, if you could, Bob, I was looking for a clarification on item number 5, dispatching and communications. It says the contractor shall employ EMD certified full-time dispatchers on a 24/7 basis under separate terms. I assume that means they would have to have some kind of a agreement, and we don't have
Yes.
to do that, but I just want a clarification there.
Right. Also, in connection with that, there's a question there that's not clear in the contract as to who supplies the radios. So
Okay, right, so we clear that
we
up.
have clarification to do. So.
All right, under 7B, personnel, right? It
Yes,
says
yes.
before an emergency, medical technician or paramedic may be assigned to provide emergency service for the town on a regular substitute basis. The designee, which would be us, must give his or her approval to the assignment. Does that mean I don't know what that means, that we're not responsible for hiring who they hire? Does that mean if we assign one of our persons?
Also needs clarification.
Okay, and then under E and F, it says the contractor is going to provide training at no cost to the town for
Yes.
personnel, for EMT personnel, which is
Correct.
good. And it says the primary ambulance will garage at this is under 9A, right? It says that the contractor shall reissue equipment and supplies used by the town's medical calls. Would that be at no cost to the town?
Well, that also needs to be clarified. I think one of the big ones in there, by the way, right in that section, has to do with response time. They're required by the terms of the contract to provide a written explanation for a response time above 20 minutes. Rose and I had talked, and we think that it ought to be 10 minutes, since the target response time is 8 minutes.
Right. Well, and that's what the other thing I bring up. There's a conflict there because in an earlier section, under 6, response time, it says that the response time would be 480 seconds.
Correct, yeah. Right.
Which would be 8 minutes.
Yes.
And then at any time over 10 minutes, the fire chief would investigate the reason why, and the chief at his or her option could assess a non-performance fine of $500.
Right.
So there's a conflict between that 10-minute and 20 minutes.
Exactly. I think what happened here is that they have a contract that's been used in a number of communities, and whoever prepared this did some cutting and pasting.
Yeah.
And there's work to be done.
Right. And then under billing, which I think is good, the contractor will provide a hardship abatement for town residents that can't afford the service for approval of the town. That's good.
Right.
And those are just the questions I had.
Right.
So
the two concerns I had, I also had 6A as a concern, which is the if they don't meet the time parameters, and they would submit a report to the fire chief and the select board within 24 hours, and the chief has the ability to assess non-performing fines. I didn't know if that's within his role. I'm not sure how that works in other communities, but I thought that was that puts him in an interesting position. So I don't know if that can be looked at. And the other one that I had was the quarterly meetings might be specified, so that we know that when they're coming up, and then that they would give a monthly report with response times. I think should be added to the board, to the town administrator and the board.
We would have to designate someone to oversee and manage this relationship and this contract with the company. The police chief has been the de facto manager under the existing arrangement with AMR, but As far as I know, we haven't formally designated the chief as the town's person to oversee and manage the contract.
There's also language in there about a ambulance oversight committee.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we should consider appointing that, and then, they would be the people who would look at those things, I guess.
I'm not so concerned about having the town side manage well. I mean, I typically talk with the police chief every day. He usually brings up any questions, and I would have the information that he has and could bring that to the board as well.
Mhm.
So then we,
I would think also in Jeff's role as emergency manager, management director, it would kind of devolve properly into oversight of the ambulance as well. I think it goes back
Yes.
to Mary Ellen's point. Should it be the fire chief, or would the police chief, who's more of a 24/7 person, be more logical for that type of thing?
Right.
All right, so Rose is looking at that.
Mhm.
Any other comments
She
on
is.
the ambulance contract?
I'm wondering with the $500 fines, whether that's arbitrary and whether it should be spelled out, on the third such occasion or, something so that there would be some consistency. But that's something that Rose and you can debate maybe, Mark, Bob.
I will give you a copy of her markup as soon as I receive it tomorrow morning,
Mhm.
and you can continue to review it and see what other comments you have.
Mhm.
And in the meantime, you'll see that a lot of it is it's not substantive.
Mhm.
It's the town is spelled capital TOWN, and it should be capital T, capital O, capital W, capital N, because that's the way we designate the town side at the top of the contract. That kind of stuff.
Yeah. Can you,
But there are substantive issues that really need to be addressed, and clearly that's a decision of the board in conjunction with Action Ambulance.
okay. Can you put that up on the cloud, Bob?
Put it in the cloud,
Yeah,
sure.
all right, easier to review.
And just the other reminder that we all know that this is a July 1st implementation date. So we're sort of
Correct.
right down to the wire
Yes.
here. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
As far as the other contract with McNamara,
Mhm.
that's in my report. But anyway, that she's also reviewing that, and we should have that in a short amount of time.
Mhm.
Okay, are Mr. Kiernan and Mr. Barber on?
Mr. Barber is here.
Okay,
Um,
good evening. Thank you,
Hi.
Howard. Thank you very much so we got a rather lengthy agenda tonight, and I'm sure you're busy as well. So permit me to kind of summarize the issue. Due to the disruption of the traditional school year, the region understandably did not incur certain anticipated expenses that they would normally have in a normal school year. And that resulted in approximately $1 million savings in their operation budget, $200,000 in transportation expenses. And additionally, the committee regrettably had to furlough paraprofessionals with the anticipation of an additional $190,000 saving. Prior to that, the committee had passed a $49 million budget, and that budget, because of rising costs and everything else, resulted in them having to cut 15, I believe it is, professional positions. So the current concern now for them is, and for us, is that the Chapter 70 monies, we don't know what they're going to be. There's some anticipation that to be 10% less, which would be roughly a $1.2 million cut in the Chapter 70 funding to the school committee, the regional school committee. And their proposal, or what they want to do, what they will do, I guess, is take a portion of those I'll use the word savings from the expenses they didn't incur in 2020, and use that to pay the collaborative expenses forward for 3 months, And in that way, if there's a $1.2 million cut, that would be absorbed by that. They wouldn't take such a hit. And they have, and with but the transportation money is a little bit different because it's a credit. And the towns have paid for that. So I guess my question is, and the region has several options they could do. They could vote to reduce the 2020 budget and change the assessments, but that's kind of a complicated and unnecessary process, I think. They could just reduce the assessment this year for the $200,000, or they could put money into the E&D. So I'm trying to understand the credit. So the credit is that the transportation people will bill you less next year?
So let me kind of go over a couple of components of what you said to kind of re-summarize. So based on the current fiscal year 20 budget, that basically is including the 2020 assessment that was voted on last March from the school committee,
Yep.
and then approved by the two towns back in last May. I believe it was May 11th of 2019. So that was the overall assessments for the fiscal year 2020. So of our approximate total $49 million budget, it's made up of components such as Chapter 70, special ed transportation reimbursement, regular ed transportation reimbursement under Chapter 71. It's made up of our various levels of the assessment, the minimum Chapter 70, the excess of Chapter 70, our Minnetonka regional costs, as well as our overall transportation assessment. So those are the various pieces of the fiscal year 20 budget that was made up of the assessment that we're currently working on. Now, with the current situation at hand, and obviously with COVID-19, there's circumstances that are above and beyond what we could have budgetarily implied that we were going to have to pick up and occur during the fiscal year 2020. But also contrary to that, we were able to go through with our due diligence to try to cut and reduce certain types of costs that we knew we weren't going to have. As an example, substitutes. We don't need substitutes because we're not having class. So we're paying our teachers, paying our paraprofessionals, paying all of the contracted individuals as we need to for the contract, and then providing respective services to our students. With that being said, as we were going through and we were able to reduce some of those costs, again, such as the substitute, some of the transportation costs, they were being reduced. Altogether, we had approximately, and I'm just rounding, about $3.4 million total transportation budget for 2020. Of that, Lower Pioneer Valley Education Collaborative basically maintains 99% of our transportation, our regular ed, our special ed, our vocational, etc. So in doing their due diligence as well, they had gone through and they were able to reduce some of the components that because we pay quarterly our installments to the Lower Pioneer Valley for our transportation. So back in March, we had already cut our 4th installment. So because we had paid along with the other 5 districts that are part of Lower Pioneer Valley, they are in essence providing us a credit for what they were able to determine to be excess. Now their total excess at the time when this first roundtable discussion had started up was going to be around $700,000, and it has been reducing. So about less than a month ago, they gave us a value originally that Hampden Wilbraham Regional School Department was going to be receiving approximately a $200,000 credit that we can apply towards next fiscal year's transportation costs. We're still going to have approximately a projected 3.4, and again, I'm just keeping this simple number, similar to this year's, a similar transportation cost for next year. So the cost is there still in the budget. So what we have the opportunity of doing is taking that, again, $3.4 million value, reducing it by them offsetting it with this pre-applied $200,000 credit, which again, appears to be being reduced, just so you know. I don't have a final number. I'm hoping to get that tomorrow because I have a meeting with them to determine the final value. But when that value comes in, whether it's $200,000, whether it's $150,000, that is going to, in essence, reduce the overall district cost of operation. We're still looking at, based on our budget, approximately another $49 million. So since it's money in the current fiscal year for 2020, we're basically utilizing those funds, prepaying, in some cases, next year's obligation just to reduce the total cost of what fiscal year 21 is going to be. Don, based on that, the component of what we're able to do is they're not going to cut us a check. They're not going to reimburse us. But unfortunately, it's part of what we can provide back to reducing next year's total cost of operations. In addition, you had referenced about that $1 million worth of savings we've been able to go through currently for the current fiscal year. So just like everything else, by being able to reduce our substitute costs, reducing some of our out-of-pocket, our classroom materials and other operating expenses that would take place during the course of the 2020 year, two things take place. If we don't spend it, it would go into our E&D. Our E&D, unfortunately, because it's not certified until at the earliest September of next year, that additional $1 million, we would not be able to apply that against next year's budget. We would have to wait until after the certification process, because right now, we started this year with $1,385,000. We've offset this year's proposed 2021 budget by a total of about $750,000 of it, which means there's only $600,000 left in E&D after this budget would be approved, as the school committee has already voted and approved it. So there's no way for us to use that $1 million to apply towards next year. It's also built into the current budget, the current assessment that was provided to us. So that money doesn't go back to the towns, just like that $200,000 doesn't go back to the towns. It's part of what the school department's overall fiscal year 20 budget was, and that's what we're maintaining. So the intent is to use the credit from Lower Pioneer Valley for their excess percentage of reimbursement, which is going to be, again, the highest it will be 200. But I'm thinking it's coming down potentially closer to maybe 150 now. So that will be applied against next year's costs. In addition, that the $1 million, we have two components that we can do for pre-planning next fiscal year. Number one, and many of you might have already heard this at the school committee meeting, we can prepay 3 months worth of special ed out-of-district costs, which allows us flexibility for our out-of-district placement of special ed services, or we can prepay collaborative services without a restriction up to the projected cost for a full year. We're not going to go that route because we want to be mindful. We don't even know what's going to happen come September. Our goal and our hope is that we're going to be back in the school and we're going to be having classes and we're going to be having transportation and all these components, but these are things that we can't formally forecast yet because we're just not there yet. So in all, those are two of those pieces based on your original comments as far as where those monies are. So approximately 1.2 million that we have currently in the fiscal year 20 that we're looking to apply to next year, fiscal year 21, that's just to reduce the top side of the budget based on the current funding. The assessments are still going to be there. The intent is because we're trying to absorb what the Chapter 70 reduction is going to be. We're going to look at probably at least a minimum of 10% loss in our average 12 million. That's the $1.2 million that we're referring to. And so this was going to absorb that loss from state funds. We're still going to see a loss potentially in Chapter 71. The regional reimbursement, they're projecting to go down as well. They're projecting our circuit breaker, which is another funding offset, to also go down. So the district and I are working diligently to try to see what other types of scenarios we can do to absorb these financial losses, not only by those that we know are going to be our level budget from what we've applied to the assessment to the towns, but knowing that we're going to have at least a minimum of probably a projected $1.2 million off the state fundings, and that's what we're going to apply to. If we were to give those back to the town, not only would we be covering for 1.2 million worth of lost state funds, we'd now be looking for another 1.2 million worth of local funds. So we would have to cut another $2.4 million from the budget on top of what we already did this year, based on having that initial level budget that many of you probably heard my presentation back in March.
All right, let me be clear. I'm not talking about the $1 million because I understand that that money is just a surplus that came for very unusual circumstances. What I'm trying to get at is the $200,000 credit. We've paid the bill, and so now it's being credited. So your transportation bill next year is going to be $200,000 less because of the credit. Is that correct?
So our overall bill is still $3.4 million. We are applying $200,000 of our credit that they were going to provide to us as long as it stays at 200,000. But like I had mentioned a little while ago, it appears that that credit value is going to be being reduced. So if we apply that credit against the transportation by itself, what that is doing is that's going to be reducing the overall 2021 total budget, of which a portion of that total budget, approximately $12 million of it, is used by state revenues. So if the state revenues go down, and then we simply take that 200,000 estimated and give it back as a reduction of local assessments, we now are not only dealing with 200,000 worth of offset there, but now we're going to be at a $400,000 loss of assessment value.
Okay, let me make it easy for me because I only have an MBA in finance. So you're going to write a check. If you pay the entire bill for transportation, your check this year would be $3,200,000 because you got a $200,000 credit, not $3,400,000.
Our bill next year is 3.4 million as of right now.
Is that the check you're going to write?
That is what we're going to pay over 4 equal installments next fiscal year, based on our budget being approximately 49 million and change.
So what happened to the $200,000 credit?
As of right now, I haven't given it to anybody. It's sitting in an account that we will apply to next year.
To the transportation budget or to the general overall budget?
To the overall budget, which basically will be used to reduce a portion of one of the department costs.
Right.
Which is
Right, in anticipation of not getting the full funding or getting 1.2 million less in funding in Chapter 70.
Correct. So what we're doing is we're applying this credit as part of what our overall Chapter 70 reduction is going to be. And even with that being applied, we're still at a minimum $1 million shortfall based on what the school committee approved budget is. Then, because we have so many other types of what's called offsets and reductions of cost of operations, such as our Title Is, our IDEA grants, our revolving accounts, all of these things that we're speaking about, including transportation reimbursement that we get from the state under Chapter 71, those values on top of the Chapter 70 are looked to be being reduced as well. And so if the Chapter 71 gets reduced, even though I'm talking about 1.2 million, which is 10%, this is more funding that we're going to be losing as far as a financial resource from the state, which means the district is going to have to make additional reductions on top of those 15 FTEs that you referred to, as well as the other approximate $2 million that we cut from the overall fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 21 cost of operations.
Okay. Anything else? The other selectmen have questions?
Well, I would just point out, I know budgeting is complicated, and I know that it's an art rather than a science many times. And I know that the region is going to have a difficult time funding the services that it wants to provide to its students. Okay. By the same token, that $200,000 is money that we spent, and the appropriate place for that money to go back to is the people that paid it. If you don't do that, you are saying you will decide how to spend our money. And you're doing that, it seems to me, you're doing that because you're in a tight fiscal situation, which I can certainly appreciate. Every place you look is going to be reduced here or there, and you're looking for more sources of money. But I'm not sure that it's appropriate to just encumber our money and say, okay, well, this is where I'm going to use it. That's my concern.
So
you get a credit when you go to a store, they give you the credit back. They don't say, well, okay, we'll put it on this purchase for the next year or the next whatever. That isn't how credits usually work, and it's just frustrating. And we, as a town, face the same problems you face as a region. Not as significant, grant you, but still the same fiscal concerns that you have.
So retail sales of purchasing and returning is nowhere near what governmental financial accounting is for a state agency. What we can do from this perspective, and I'll be completely honest with you, with the $1 million I was speaking about relating directly to the excess funds that we're going to receive, and we're going to apply those against specific costs of next fiscal year, Let's just say, for instance, I tell Lower Pioneer Valley, I don't want you to apply this to next year's credit at all. Cut me a check today. They issue it to me. It goes back to my general funds of fiscal year 2020. I now have 1.2 million in my current fiscal year. I then take that full amount, I apply it all to my E&D. I then use that entire E&D against next fiscal year. You notice how it goes to E&D. There is no credit ever in the past 25, 35 years that we've had E&D through the district. We have never issued back a credit because we've also never exceeded the 5%. So the use of this funding is just like we're taking those assessments and we're using those assessments to go back into the excess and efficiency or to pre-purchase special ed out of district placement to special ed, to the collaborative costs. It's the same process of it. These funds don't go back respectively because they were appropriated from the town of Hampden, just like with the town of Wilbraham, back last May of 2019, which means that it's the current district's funds for fiscal year 20.
I can appreciate the money goes back into E&D, okay? And the money is usually of a smaller nature. This is a large amount of money, and it is a very unusual circumstance. So I think it's not, $20,000 that you're over in an account or something. It's a significant amount of money, and it is a significant situation that we find ourselves in. And I think that we don't do it the same way that we may have done things that are more minor.
And so this past fiscal year, I cut over $2.4 million from our fiscal year 21 budget to start with, based on the mandated cost increases that we incurred. Last year, I cut over $1.7 million from the fiscal year budget. So this year, because instead of cutting those costs, we're now being identified by the state that we have to formally reduce our anticipated assessments by approximately a minimum, not assessment, but the state funds that we're going to receive, approximately 1.2 million. We don't get to say, we don't get to use that as just a matter of us applying and purchasing additional materials or supplies. It's because of the funding restrictions that we're being provided from the state, because just like everything else, there's a reduction in state funds that they're projecting that's not only going to be a 1 year, but this is going to be a cumulative impact to us, because even if we cut 10% this year, come fiscal year 22, the state's not going to give us a 2% increase on local aid, Chapter 70, and then say, by the way, let me also retroactively give you the 10% cut from 2 years ago. So this is going to be a cumulative impact to us.
Right.
So by being able to absorb and utilize these funds for this type of collaborative service, as well as these out-of-district placements, which again, they're mandated costs. We have to transport our students. We have to provide them the out-of-district placement necessary based on their IEPs and their student service needs that are for all of these students that we have in our district. We can't just, again, they're mandated costs. So for the next few years, this 1.2 million being referred to based on the $200 million title, those are all going to be maximized based on the most efficient and effective way that the school department can utilize them without having a deficit that's going to directly impact our students and their education.
All right, let me just ask you one final question. Your budget for fiscal year 2020 was 49 million. What is it for next year, or for fiscal 21?
So the current approved budget was 49,295. 49,295,449.
Okay, thank you.
Allie, it's Heather Zanetti. Can I just say one thing?
Sure, Heather.
I think the point is that the 200,000 was paid last year by both towns. The towns put in the money. That's the taxpayers' money. I think that at the least we could have done is said, you know what, you guys paid for the 200,000. We didn't use it all. Would you like it back to the towns? Would you like us to give it back to the towns, or would you like us to put it in towards this year's coming budget? I think it was just the principle of at least offering the towns, hey, this is your money. It's your taxpayers' money. Would you guys like it back? Could you use it back? And right now, under these circumstances, everybody is struggling, and we don't know what next year is going to be. So I think that was just the point, is that it should have at least been offered.
Heather, just like all the other times, right now the school department is looking at a total, since we started the budget back in November, we're going to be reducing $3.6 million of costs from last year's level service budget. $3.6 million I am cutting from the budget, from staffing to services to programming. implementing new resources of funding resources based on achieving additional grants, reaching out to every individual location and facility to try to get additional resources for us as a school department. So when you think about what the 200,000 you're referring to, that was assessed last fiscal year. It's just like all of our other E&D. It comes back, it's directly assigned and approved by the school committee. It's then approved by the towns based on the special town meeting. All of them assess those fundings to the school department, just like every other opportunity since we started this regional agreement back decades ago. So those funding resources have never gone back to the town because, again, they were already assessed. They're fiscal year 20, they're not fiscal year 21. And so those fundings wouldn't be approved back, because if so, then we would also be changing almost a lot of other components and potentially things specifically in the regional agreement.
I see this as analogous to just the way the town budget works. Typically, if we over budget and get money back, say on the police salaries or something like that, it goes into free cash, and then we can apply it to next year's budget. This isn't the only account that hopefully you have savings in. You might have had savings in personnel costs, savings in heating costs, and all those savings go to your E&D account and then hopefully get targeted towards next year's budget. Is this really any different?
No, you're basically right on, John. I think just like what the town utilizes that for your free cash, that's the same resourcing that we do for the school department. I mean, the school department's E&D is the equivalent of the town's free cash. And we have to be mindful.
Any budget item that hopefully comes in spent less would actually allow for more money to reduce the impact of next year.
Yeah, and that's why right now, like I said, after going through and we've been vetting, closing out peer purchase orders, negotiating with vendor after vendor after vendor, trying to reduce the projected costs, basically making our due diligence to say, you want our services, well, instead of paying $1 per service, let's pay 75 cents per service, so that way we could, again, try to be as financially solvent as possible to find and generate more financial resources for us to be able to utilize against offsets. And again, that's where I referred to a little while ago. I mean, we're looking at applying for every kind of grant that's possibly out there, even if it's a one-time appropriation. It's going to at least be able to level the playing field so that we don't have to make additional staffing reductions or reducing additional things. The one other thing to keep in mind, we are in a major circumstance above and beyond where we have ever been. Nobody has ever considered having this type of a virus per se with Corona that's going through the school department and putting us in situations where we can't forecast it. We don't even know yet if our school is going to open the first day of school. Are we going to have to ensure that we provide additional special ed services for these students, all these special ed students at their homes? Are we going to have to provide, additional instruction? Are we going to have to split classrooms? There's so many things that we don't know yet because we haven't been even given some direct guidance from the governor, or even the Ways and Means hasn't passed their formal state portion of the budget. So these are the things that we're trying to do the best forecasting as we can, knowing that in the end, we need to be able to provide instruction and be able to attribute the goals necessary to show the Hampden-Wilbraham Regional School District is still one of the best school departments in the state of Massachusetts.
So am I correct in saying
Let me go back a minute. Go ahead, John.
Okay. Am I correct,
Go
Howard,
ahead, John.
before Don's point, that next year's appropriation for the town of Hampden only, you're looking at between bonding and the school assessment, a drop of about $65,000?
The overall assessment was down to approximately 43,000.
That's for the assessment part. And then the bond costs also dropped, looks like another 11,000 on top of that for both the high school and Green Meadows. So basically the school cost of the town of Hampden is down 65,000 for next year.
Yes. Sorry, my apology. I was looking directly at the regional. I wasn't including that.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this question, Mr. Barber. You said that the budget was $49 million, and that's up, I think, 1.76% from last year, but you're cutting $3,600,000, so I kind of got lost there.
So when you're looking at the fiscal 2021 budget, based on mandated costs, we have contracted costs for all of our staff.
Mhm.
We have out-of-district placement costs. So say, for instance, you happen to be going to a out-of-district placement location for one of our special ed students. The cost for that one student could be anywhere from $100,000 to potentially $400,000 a year for one student's out-of-district placement service costs.
So just briefly, so what you're saying is the contracted cost, the mandated cost are the increase, and it has to be offset by $3.6 million cut.
Let me rephrase this because you're going a little bit beyond where I started. Last fiscal, when I proposed the budget initially, back in March, I had identified that we had reduced mandated costs by approximately $2 million. I'm just using flatter numbers. I don't have the exact dollar in front of me. So we reduced $2 million from the budget based on those mandated costs. Again, union contracts, all those different components. Now, on top of already cutting the $2 million worth of these costs, we're now going to have potentially a shortfall based on the state value that the Chapter 70 is going to be able to give us. So if the state's trying to tell us that instead of having $12 million worth of state revenues under Chapter 70, it's potentially going to be $10.8 million, or again, 10% of that being reduced. So for us, what we're trying to do is that our overall costs are still going to be there, but our intent is to use the excess fundings that we're purposely cutting this year to be able to take this $1 million worth of excess from fiscal year 20 to apply it against that cost of fiscal year 21. In addition, the ability of the refund or the excess against the transportation costs from Lower Pioneer Valley, that excess, again, approximately the highest side is 200,000, be able to also apply that as well. So altogether, this is, again, another $1.2 million. If we were to have given that directly back to the town, let's just say, as assessment, and this is both for Hampden and Wilbraham, that doesn't mean that we're reducing anything at all against what we're going to need additional fundings for because of the loss of state revenues. If the state still takes 1.2 million away from their state monies, we would now be at a shortfall. On top of reducing the assessment by 1.2 million, we would still be short another 1.2 million because the Chapter 70 is going to go from 12 million down to 10.8 million worth of fundings for us. And that's where I was referring to. We would end up having to come up with additional monies to be able to fund more resources instead of making more cuts that we can't sustain that kind of a cut this year.
Okay, so we'll let you go in a minute. I got 4 yes or no questions. Okay, so yes or no. Does the district have a regional transportation reimbursement fund?
A regional transportation fund?
Regional reimbursement fund.
We have a revolving account that we utilize, but that question doesn't sound correct. Not. Let me confirm what that potentially question could mean, because there's a couple different ways I could approach that, but I don't believe that I'm hearing that question correctly.
All right. Does the region have a special education stabilization fund?
Yes.
Okay. And does the region have its own stabilization fund, or is that the E&D?
Yes, we have stabilization fund. That's what usually we appropriate $50,000 to each year out of our E&D to provide us the resource. If we don't utilize that stabilization fund in that current fiscal year, the funds in essence go back to E&D. But last year we did not assess the $50,000 for fiscal year 20 for that 50,000.
Okay. Now the other question I have is the elementary and secondary school portion of the CARES Act. Are you guys anticipating being able to offset anything with that?
Well, the issue with the CARES Act is that this is going to be a one-time, again, funding that's going to be provided approximately an estimated 80% of our Title I. So that's looking at approximately, give or take, about another about 220,000 is what they projected. So if those fundings come through, we only have those funds for a total of 27 months. And that's to try to help absorb these uncertain costs that we're going to be identifying, such as if we do have to do specific services for students, things like that, without opening the doors, planning materials, potentially having to take temperatures for students walking in the door that we never had to do before, and bringing additional staff in. So these are some of those components that those fundings are to be able to be maximized for.
All right. And lastly, you don't know the answer to this, so nobody does. Where are we in terms of opening in September?
Still at a standstill. I think the intent is that we're trying to do our due diligence. We're trying to create a couple game plans as far as opportunities that we can. We're trying to look ahead. I think if I'm going to be blunt with it, we know how to open the doors if school goes in full session. What we're
Yeah.
trying to do is we're trying to come up with project plans as far as what happens if we can't. You know, if we have to split classrooms, if we have to do all virtual, there's so many different scenarios that are there. But the issue with that at hand is that until we get some guidance as far as where we're going to be, we have to be able to, unfortunately, cover all of these costs, not knowing where we're going to do, what we're going to be on effective the 26th of August.
Okay, and last one, it just popped into my head. What happens, what if there's a 1/12 budget? If the towns can't meet or,
Absolutely. So what happens to the 27th? So let's just say, for instance, on the 15th of June, the two towns don't vote and they don't approve the assessed budget values that were approved by the school committee. On July 1st, the superintendent, we have to draft and submit a letter to the commissioner of the Department of Elementary Secondary Education. He will, or Commissioner Riley will then validate and approve the acceptance of the non-approved budget. Then what happens is that each town of the regional agreement will be assessed equal 1/12th assessment at a minimum of what the 2020 fiscal year assessment is. So keeping in mind, the assessment for 2020 is higher than the assessment for 2021. So the town of Hampden will actually be paying us approximately 1/12th higher of that. I think John had mentioned about the $60,000 number. So approximately 1/12th of that will be higher than what the actual budget would have been if it had passed, until we get through the overall approval process.
Okay, all right, thank you for your time. Does anyone in the selectmen have a question?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Barber, for your time. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Howie. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Heather.
You're very
Thank
welcome. Is there going to be additional
Maura.
questions? Is there going to be additional questions
Thank you.
regarding the further 21 budget review, or is that solely for the school? I just, looking at the agenda, I want to make sure if there's additional information that you need. I think that was the 6:45 timeline.
No, I think that's ours.
Oh, okay. I just want to make sure I'm here for you if you need it.
No, those issues aren't about the school. That's yeah.
Well, I appreciate everyone's time and effort this evening. Thank you very much, and please be healthy and safe, and my best wishes for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Okay. All right. Next item on the agenda is the municipal vulnerability program update. Robert?
Bob, you're muted.
Bob, you
It's working out great.
there, Bob?
It's a vulnerability he has.
It was so stimulating, he left.
Is he muted?
There we
I
go.
muted myself, yes. We're moving ahead with that. What we're asking for tonight is for the selectmen to vote to sign a letter of support, which will be placed in the mailroom for your individual signatures. Normally, you might just vote and say to me to sign it, but I think it's important that we have the three selectmen, or the majority of the selectmen, signing this letter of support for the program.
Could you provide the people that are with us tonight on Zoom with a brief overview of what that program is so that they understand what we're voting on?
Yes, this is a state program. It's been in existence maybe 3 years. It provides money for two purposes. Number one, planning. You do an overall plan for the community, assessing vulnerabilities in case of severe weather, storms, flooding, and so forth. And you pick out those areas of the town where there's vulnerability. And then secondly, once the plan is in place, the town can apply for state grants in order to address some of the vulnerabilities. The most important issue right now, it seems, from an earlier report, has to do with several culverts on North Main Street, where the Big Brook and the East Brook flow into the Scantic River. There's been flooding there in the past. And clearly, if we have more severe rain, we'll have more flooding there in the future. And so that would be the initial area to be targeted, but we're asking for support for the program so that an overall plan can be developed, not just for North Main Street, but for other parts of the community that are vulnerable to severe storms. And then once we've assessed that, the town becomes eligible for state funding. There is no local match required. There are no local funds that will be required. This will not affect the tax rate. It's taking advantage of a state program that has been quite successful statewide. And I think I mentioned to the selectmen earlier that the secretary for this program is from the town of Hampden, went to Minnechaug High School, and actually made contact with me, I believe, in February, suggesting that she would like to see her hometown participating in the program. So I think if we can get support for it, I'm fairly confident that the town's program would be funded.
Thank you.
So you're going to leave that in the mailroom for our signatures, maybe when we go down to the warrant as well?
Yeah, I would suggest a vote, also a formal vote, to support the municipal vulnerability program, and then we'll leave a letter for your signatures in the mailroom.
I'll make a motion to support the municipal vulnerability program.
Second. Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
See, Don, you should have had to repeat it.
All right. Is it unanimous?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. The next item on the agenda is the FY21 budget review, further budget review. So the first thing I think we have to do is add that $3,000 to the, I've spoken to I asked Bob to speak to the building inspector. We had increased the hours now, but he's agreeable to just increase it by 3 hours, which would be a reduction of about $6,000 in that account. This would be, he's doing 34 hours a week now. This would increase his hours to 37. That's about a $6,000 decrease in the amount that we had originally requested, and he's good with that. Is that correct, Bob?
Correct. I sent him a message asking if he could sustain a reduction there, and he said yes. He said what is, or something like that, but he's okay with it.
Right.
Well, that doesn't sound like a lot of choice. I mean, I don't think we're that tight. I would have to say I'm not. Don, you made a great case before that with the increased work for stormwater, et cetera, he needed the extra hours. I think we should leave it in there. I mean, you really did a good job of justifying the increased hours before. You know, he was working hard. I don't see a need really to cut that.
All right.
Support it.
And was there also secretarial hours in his proposal?
Two
Yeah, both.
hours, 2 additional secretary hours. And that's because there's a lot of reports they have to do.
Mhm.
So is the general consensus, we'll leave that alone?
He is flat out. I have to say, any of us who've contacted Wendell, he is working every hour plus.
Okay.
I don't have a problem with that, but I do think that it's always hard to make decisions to cut, and this is an increase. And while the work may indeed be there, I can appreciate that. If you do it for one, you should do it for all, and it just gets to be a slippery slope.
It is true. However, the point is that, you know, this is one of the things where you're doing mandated inspections. And if you cut the hours and something isn't done, you can open the town up to potential action down the road. And that's not good.
All right. We can leave it. And the next item that I thought about, we should stipend, the train stipend.
The what?
Training stipend.
stipend.
It's 01222519, something like that.
Yeah. I saw Eddie's original email. It didn't sound like there was any opportunity to cut that.
Yeah, well, it's 32,000.
This is the fire department, right?
Fire department. This is 32,000,
Yeah,
which he's
okay.
been budgeting.
Mhm.
Last year he spent 21,000. He's only spent 14,000 this year. And I'm wondering with the ambulance contract, doing some training, that would be help a bit. So I had suggested to him that if we could reduce it by 7,500 to 7,000 to 25,000, but he was a little reluctant to do that because he's got
Because what?
5 new probationary people that he has to train. Yes.
Well, they're not that new. The probationary people were 2018, 18, 19, and 2 are in 20. One is in 20. So they're not all that new. My concern in the fire department in general is that their budget request is 17.8% increase over last year. And, you know, we're sort of saying that we should be holding the line at least. We asked everybody else, can you make a 5% cut? And yet his continues to come in with increased expenditures, which all may be fine in the best of times, but these aren't the best of times. So that would be my concern.
Hmm.
And there are a number of his accounts that have not been expended either, which is another issue. But
yeah. The way this is funded is similar to the transfer station monitoring. You fund it at a level that it could be expended at. For instance, we could be hit with a monitoring request at the landfill, so we fund it to the worst case. Typically, and I think Cliff would say, we see quite a bit of return there because the DEP doesn't come after us and add a test in. This is worst case for training stipend. If every guy there had every training done, this would be the amount spent. Sometimes they don't come. Sometimes to be honest, in the past, some have said they don't want the money. They appreciate the chance to serve the town and they refuse to get the money back. But his due diligence is, if everybody took their money, this is the bill. And what you gonna do with it next year? Come up with a drive and ask for the extra money? This is what he needs to fully fund the account. And at the end of the year, if another account runs short, he has the ability, with the approval of the selectmen and the advisory committee, to transfer the money and take care of like a shortfall. And Cliff, I see Cliff on. I think typically in the past, that's what's happened with, for instance, a little extra in stipend might take care of a truck repair, something like that. Cliff, inside the fire department, so to speak, overall account. If not, it rolls back to free cash. But again, it covers worst case because you can't go back in the middle of the year and get more money.
well, you can go back in the fall.
But the money's not spent in the fall. The reason it's not spent now is that the stipend money is accounted for in pretty much the last 5 to 6 weeks of the year, as they count up all the hours that people have gone in. I did see Pat on the window. I don't know if Pat wants to speak to this as Deputy Chief. Bob, I don't know if he wants to.
Yeah.
Who's speaking?
Pat Farrow was on.
That's on the.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right how Mr. Flynn explained it, where this was set up as if everyone came every week, that money was there. In the email I was CC'd on, it did explain that in the past we have not paid our probationary firefighters, and now we are paying them. So all those probationary fires will receive compensation for attending trainings throughout the year, and that account additionally pays for EMT certifications and in-house CPR first responder training. And right now the department is split where we do say 12 one year, 12 the next. But I mean, if this is what needs to happen, it could. But again, best case, it's set up this way to properly have the money in the account.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that's
go ahead. Touch on the request for a reduce in call reimbursement.
The call reimbursement. The call reimbursement is $65,000. Last year, previous year, they spent in 2018,
30.
41,000, in 2019, 30,000,
34.
and this year they spent 14,000 so far.
Mm.
So I'm thinking that's a function of having the full-time people, responding to most of the calls. So I was wondering if that was well in the ballpark,
Mm.
what they've been spending.
Good question.
Yeah, again, that I think initial budget was set up by Chief Gorski, figuring